February 18th, 1973. 7:30 in the evening, Manhattan. Frank Costello lies in a hospital bed at Doctors Hospital, staring out the window toward Queens. He is 82 years old. 11 days earlier, a heart attack struck him in his Central Park West apartment. The most powerful mob boss in American history, the man who controlled 50,000 slot machines, who owned judges and senators, who helped shape the elections of multiple presidents, is dying. His wife Loretta sits beside him. She has been there for 59 years. Through the prison sentences, through the Senate hearings, through the assassination attempt that nearly killed him. She holds his hand as his breathing slows, then stops. The Prime Minister of the Underworld is dead. His empire generated the equivalent of $60 billion in today's money. He bribed Coast Guard officers, fixed horse races for FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, and dined with future presidents at political conventions. For 2 decades, Frank Costello was the most powerful criminal in America, maybe the world. He didn't just run the mafia, he ran the politicians who were supposed to stop the mafia. But here is the thing about Frank Costello that makes his story different from every other mob boss. He had no children, not one. His wife Loretta, a Jewish showgirl he married in 1914, could not bear him any heirs. And so, the man who built a criminal dynasty built it for no one. No son to take over the family business. No daughter to marry into another powerful clan. No grandchildren to carry the Costello name into the future. His brother Edward, the one who introduced him to gang life as a boy in East Harlem, faded into obscurity decades earlier, leaving no trace in the historical record. His sisters back in Italy stayed in the mountain village he fled as a child, never crossing the Atlantic. His mistress of 20 years disappeared the moment he died, leaving behind nothing but questions. And Loretta, the widow who placed a flower on his casket, who stood alone at his grave while most of his powerful friends stayed away to protect their reputations. She vanished completely. After 1973, Loretta Costello's name appears in no public record. No death certificate has surfaced. No obituary was published in any New York newspaper. No grave marker sits beside her husband's bombed mausoleum. The wife of the most documented mob boss in American history simply ceased to exist. This is what happened to Frank Costello's family after he died, and why their story reveals the ultimate truth about building an empire with no one to inherit it. If you are new here, subscribe for more deep dives into the bloodlines of fallen power. Francesco Castiglia was born on January 26, 1891, in Laropoli, a tiny mountain village in Calabria, the toe of Italy's boot. The town clung to a hillside above the Ionian Sea, home to farmers and shepherds who had known nothing but poverty for generations. Francesco's father, Luigi, had already left for America, chasing the promise of something better than the crushing hardship of southern Italy. In 1895, 4-year-old Francesco, his mother Maria Severia Aloise, and his older brother Edward crammed onto a passenger ship bound for New York Harbor. The journey took weeks, packed into steerage with hundreds of other immigrants seeking a new life. They left behind Francesco's sister. The family could not afford to bring everyone at once. That sister, whose name does not appear consistently in historical records, would stay in Italy for the rest of her life, watching from afar as her brother became one of the most powerful men in America. Decades later, when Frank Costello returned to Laropoli as a millionaire, she would be there to translate his boasts of American wealth to the awestruck villagers. The townspeople lined up to see him, his reputation having crossed the Atlantic ahead of him. They wanted to rename the town after him. He told them that would be too much. But that triumphant reunion was far in the future. In 1895, the Castiglia family landed in East Harlem, a brutal slum packed with Italian, Jewish, Irish, and Puerto Rican immigrants all fighting for survival in the same cramped tenements. The streets stank of garbage and desperation. Disease swept through regularly. Violence was constant. Luigi opened a small grocery store in the Italian neighborhood. He worked himself to exhaustion every day, earning pennies while his customers struggled to pay even that. Young Francesco watched his father wake before dawn and collapse after dark, watched him scrape and bow, and accept whatever crumbs the neighborhood would give him. And Francesco decided something. The working man was the loser. Honest labor was for fools. The smart ones took what they wanted. His brother Edward felt the same way. By the time Francesco turned 13, Edward had introduced him to the street gangs that ruled their neighborhood. These were not organized crime syndicates yet, just packs of hungry teenagers who stole, assaulted, and robbed their way through Harlem. The boy adopted a new name, Frankie, and joined the 104th Street Gang, eventually becoming its leader. Between 1908 and 1917, Frankie was arrested repeatedly for assault and robbery. In 1912, he went to jail. In 1915, he served a full year in prison for carrying a concealed weapon. Each arrest taught him something. Each prison sentence hardened him. And somewhere in those violent years, he made a decision that would define his entire career. He would never carry a gun again. Violence was for fools. Brains made money. Connections made money. The ability to talk your way into a room, to make powerful people trust you, to smile while you robbed them blind. That was real power. In 1916, he legally changed his name from Francesco Castiglia to Frank Costello. The new name sounded Irish, useful in a city where Italian immigrants faced constant discrimination. He told people he was a plumber. Nobody believed him. In 1914, while still a petty street criminal, Frank met a woman who would change his life. Loretta Geigerman was a Jewish showgirl, pretty, high-spirited, full of dreams. She had performed in vaudeville, danced in chorus lines, and imagined a future on Broadway. Her parents had immigrated from Germany. She lived in a world of theater people and dreamers, about as far from the 104th Street Gang as you could get in New York City. And somehow, she fell for this rough Calabrian gangster with the hoarse voice and the intense eyes. On September 22, 1914, Frank Costello married Loretta Geigerman in Manhattan. He was 23, she was 19. It was a union that crossed every boundary of the era, an Italian Catholic marrying a Jewish woman, almost unheard of in the immigrant communities of the time. The Sicilian mafiosi, who would later distrust Costello for being Calabrian, would also distrust him for this marriage. He did not care. Loretta was his, and he was hers. That same year, he went to prison for 10 months on weapons charges. She waited. This would become the pattern of their marriage. Frank's crimes, Loretta's patience. His underworld deals, her quiet domesticity. His long absences, her lonely vigils. His affairs, her tolerance. Because there would be affairs. But first, there was the rise. After his 1917 release from prison, Costello connected with the Morello crime family through Ciro Terranova, a powerful East Harlem capo. The Morello gang was the predecessor of what would eventually become the Genovese family, one of the 5 families that would rule New York's underworld for the next century. While working for Morello, Costello met the man who would become his lifelong partner, Charles Lucky Luciano. Luciano was Sicilian, born in a town near Palermo. He had grown up on the Lower East Side, running with gangs just like Costello. But where Costello was smooth and diplomatic, Luciano was cunning and ruthless. Together, they made a formidable pair. The older Sicilian mafiosi did not trust Costello. They called him the dirty Calabrian, not a true Sicilian, not worthy of real power. In the old world hierarchy of organized crime, Calabrians ranked below Sicilians. Costello was an outsider, tolerated only because Luciano vouched for him. But Luciano did not care about old world prejudices. He saw Costello's gift, the ability to make friends with anyone, politicians, judges, police captains, Irish gang leaders, Jewish bootleggers. Men who would never trust a Sicilian from Mulberry Street somehow trusted this charming Calabrian who never carried a gun. Costello partnered with Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, and Vito Genovese. When Prohibition arrived in 1920, they were ready. While America went legally dry, these young gangsters built a bootlegging empire that spanned the Atlantic. Costello and his partners made fortunes smuggling liquor, backed by criminal financier Arnold Rothstein, the man who had allegedly fixed the 1919 World Series. Their boats could carry 20,000 cases of liquor at a time. They bribed Coast Guard officers to look away when the ships docked. When the bribes did not work, they hired gunmen. On November 19, 1926, Costello and bootlegging partner Bill Dwyer were indicted on federal charges for bribing 2 Coast Guard officers with $2,700. The largest boat in their smuggling fleet could carry enough liquor to supply half of Manhattan. But when the case went to trial in January 1927, the jury deadlocked. Costello walked free. He reportedly said he hung it, meaning he had bribed or intimidated enough jurors to avoid conviction. But Costello's real genius was not smuggling, it was politics. He cultivated relationships with Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that ran New York City like a private kingdom. He bribed judges, bought police captains, and made friends with mayors. He learned which politicians had gambling debts, which had mistresses, which had secrets they could not afford to see in the newspapers. And then he owned them. By the 1932 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, Costello was sharing a hotel suite with Tammany delegates at the Drake Hotel. He was introduced to Franklin D. Roosevelt, then the governor of New York and soon to be president of the United States, as a political contributor. Roosevelt shook hands with a gangster. Whether he knew it or not, we will never know. By the mid-1930s, Costello had placed 50,000 slot machines in candy stores, restaurants, nightclubs, markets, and bars across New York. Each one generated cash. Each one needed protection from the law. And Costello, through his political connections, provided that protection. He paid the police, the prosecutors, the judges, and the politicians a considerable cut. His daily income from slot machines alone was reportedly $500,000 in 1930s money. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $10 million a day. The money made everything possible. In 1934, when reformist Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia declared war on Costello's slot machines and began smashing them with sledgehammers in public displays, Costello simply moved his operation to Louisiana. Governor Huey Long, called the Kingfish, welcomed him. In exchange for a cut of the profits, Long let Costello's slots operate freely across the state. By age 34, Costello was a multi-millionaire. By 40, some estimates suggest he was worth the equivalent of $1 billion today. His income generated the equivalent of $60 billion over his career, and through it all, Loretta waited at home. They lived in a 7-room apartment at 115 Central Park West, the Majestic, a twin-towered Art Deco masterpiece that loomed over the west side of Central Park. The apartment faced the park itself, offering views that most New Yorkers could only dream about. The building stood across the street from the Dakota, where decades later John Lennon would live and die. The apartment cost $3,900 a month, a fortune in an era when most Americans earned a few $1,000s a year. They employed one maid, a black woman who stayed with them for 15 years. James Mont, the mob's top interior decorator, designed the space in what could only be called mafia glitz. A Howard Chandler Christie painting hung over the fireplace. A gold-plated grand piano sat in the living room. Slot machines were rigged to perpetually pay out so guests would feel lucky. Costello would ask visitors, "What do you think I am? A punk? Nobody loses in my house." In summer, they retreated to a mansion in Sands Point, Long Island, Gatsby territory, where the old money families had their estates. Costello cultivated roses there. He entered his flowers in local horticultural competitions. He became known as a devoted gardener. For a mob boss, Costello lived quietly. He rarely stayed out past 10 o'clock. He had his nails manicured and polished, a detail that would later become infamous when millions of Americans watched his hands on television during Senate hearings. He saw a psychiatrist weekly, unusual for any man in the 1940s, and unheard of for a gangster. The doctor told him to mix with better people to overcome his inferiority complex. Considering Costello already counted Supreme Court judges, mayors, senators, and at least one future president among his friends, it is hard to imagine who else he could have added to his social circle. But there was a darkness in that quiet, privileged life. Loretta could not have children. The reasons are lost to history. Medical records from the era do not survive, and neither Frank nor Loretta ever spoke publicly about it. Perhaps it was a physical condition. Perhaps it was a choice made after some long-forgotten tragedy. We will never know, but the absence of children shaped everything. In Italian-American culture, especially in the mafia, children were legacy. Sons carried on the family name, inherited the business, and avenged their fathers when enemies struck. Daughters married into allied families, cementing alliances that could last for generations. Children were power extended into the future. Children were immortality. Frank Costello had no future, no immortality, no sons to sit at the head of the family table after he was gone. And perhaps because of this, he sought comfort elsewhere. Her name was Thelma Martin, sometimes recorded as Felma Martin in historical documents. She was Costello's mistress for over 20 years, beginning sometime in the 1930s or early 1940s. He paid $4,500 a year for her apartment on Fifth Avenue, just across Central Park from where he lived with Loretta. In her building, Frank was known as John Martin, her husband. He bought Thelma a Cadillac. He kept her in fine clothes and jewelry. He visited her several nights a week, returning home to Loretta afterward. At one point, paranoid that Thelma was seeing other men, he bought a telescope and used it to watch her apartment windows from across the park. Later in life, he would say this was the thing he was most ashamed of, spying on his mistress with a telescope. Not the murders he had ordered, not the judges he had corrupted, not the politicians he had owned, the telescope. Loretta knew about Thelma. According to some accounts, she tolerated the affair precisely because she could not give Frank children. It was an arrangement, silent and painful, the kind of bargain that wealthy couples made in an era when divorce meant scandal and ruin. But Thelma, like Loretta, would produce no heirs for Frank Costello. Whatever arrangement existed between the three of them, it produced nothing that would last beyond their lifetimes. And Frank's brother Edward? The one who had introduced him to crime as a boy? By the 1940s, Edward had faded completely from the historical record. He appears in no significant accounts of Costello's criminal career. He shows up in no trial transcripts, no newspaper articles, no FBI surveillance reports. Whatever happened to him, death, estrangement, or simple retreat into obscurity, Edward Castiglia left no mark on history. The only family member who maintained any connection to Frank's public legacy was his sister in Italy. And that connection was purely symbolic, a single visit home, a translation of his boasts, a refusal to let them rename the town. But this protected life had a fatal weakness. Frank Costello had no heir to protect it, no son to groom for leadership, no daughter to marry into an allied family, no grandchildren to remember him as anything other than a name on a mausoleum. In 1936, Lucky Luciano was convicted of running a prostitution ring and sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. Vito Genovese, who had served as Luciano's underboss, was named acting boss. But within a year, Genovese himself fled to Italy to escape murder charges in New York. Frank Costello became acting boss of the Luciano crime family. He was now the most powerful mob boss in New York, maybe in America. Enemies circled. For 15 years, Costello held power through diplomacy rather than violence. He mediated disputes between families. He maintained the political connections that kept everyone out of prison. He avoided the bloodshed that had marked earlier eras of mob rule. But in 1946, Vito Genovese returned from Italy. His murder charges had mysteriously collapsed when the key witness died in jail, poisoned with enough drugs to kill 6 men. Genovese expected to resume his position as underboss, to sit at Costello's right hand, and eventually take over. Costello had other ideas. He had run the family for nearly a decade. He was not about to step aside for Vito Genovese. The rivalry festered for years. In 1951, the Kefauver Committee, a Senate investigation into organized crime, called Costello to testify in televised hearings that would captivate the nation. His lawyers negotiated a strange arrangement. The cameras could broadcast the hearing live to millions of Americans, but they could not show Costello's face. So, America watched his hands. For hours, millions of viewers saw Frank Costello's manicured fingers drumming on the table, rubbing together, touching his water glass, crumpling a handkerchief when he was nervous. His hoarse voice, damaged by a botched throat operation years earlier, answered questions evasively. He dodged and weaved. He pleaded forgetfulness. He played dumb. When Senator Estes Kefauver asked what good Costello had done for his country, he replied simply, "Paid my tax." The audience in the chamber laughed. But Costello wasn't laughing. He knew this was the beginning of the end. He walked out of the hearings before they concluded, unable to stomach another day of questioning. The result was an 18-month prison sentence for contempt of the Senate. In 1954, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 5 more years. He was released on appeal in 1957, having served over 3 years. His wealth began to drain, legal fees mounted, assets were frozen. The political connections that had protected him for decades began to evaporate as politicians distanced themselves from the toxic publicity of the Kefauver hearings. And Vito Genovese decided it was time to make his move. On May 2nd, 1957, around 11 o'clock at night, Frank Costello returned to the Majestic after dinner at Monsignore restaurant in Manhattan. His wife Loretta had been with him at dinner. So had theatrical agent Phil Kennedy. Loretta took a separate cab home. Costello and Kennedy shared another. At 115 Central Park West, Costello entered the lobby of his building. The doorman nodded. Everything seemed normal. Then a large man in a dark coat stepped out of the shadows and said, "This is for you, Frank." The gunman raised a pistol and fired. The bullet grazed Costello's skull, carving a bloody furrow across his scalp but missing his brain by inches. He staggered backward. Blood poured down his face, soaking his suit. The gunman fled into the night. Doorman Norval Keith saw the whole thing. He would later identify the shooter as Vincent Gigante, a hulking enforcer who worked for Vito Genovese. Loretta rushed to the building when she heard what happened. Phil Kennedy called for an ambulance. At Roosevelt Hospital, doctors found no serious damage. The bullet had come within millimeters of killing him, but somehow missed anything vital. The Prime Minister of the Underworld had survived an assassination attempt. Barely. At the hospital, police found something interesting in Costello's pocket, a slip of paper with figures totaling over $27,000. They matched exactly the casino revenues from the Tropicana in Las Vegas for the previous 2 weeks. It was proof that Costello still had his fingers in illegal gambling, despite his claims of retirement. But the bigger question was who had tried to kill him. At trial, Costello refused to identify his attacker. He said, "I didn't see nothing," while looking directly at Vincent Gigante in the courtroom. Gigante was acquitted, but the message was clear. Vito Genovese wanted Costello dead, and if Costello stayed in power, Genovese would try again. Costello retired from active leadership of the crime family. Genovese took control. The Luciano family became the Genovese family. And Frank Costello, at 66 years old, became an elder statesman of organized crime, respected, consulted, but no longer in command. His final years were strange and quiet. He still lived at the Majestic with Loretta. He still commanded respect from younger mobsters who remembered his glory days. Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese visited his Waldorf Astoria penthouse to seek his advice on important matters. His old friend Meyer Lansky stayed in touch. When disputes arose between families, Costello was sometimes called to mediate, but his bank accounts were drained from legal battles. According to multiple sources, he had to ask friends for loans in his final years. The man who once controlled the equivalent of billions was borrowing money to maintain his lifestyle. In 1961, the Supreme Court stripped him of his United States citizenship, ruling that he had lied on his naturalization papers decades earlier. 3 years later, in 1964, another court ruling blocked his deportation on a legal technicality. Costello stayed in New York. He took up gardening with renewed passion. Roses became his obsession. He cultivated them at his Sands Point estate, entering them in local horticultural competitions. He won prizes. He displayed his flowers at shows. He found peace in something that grew and bloomed and required nothing from him but patience. He socialized with actor Anthony Quinn and other celebrities who did not mind being seen with a retired mob boss. Author Peter Moss began interviewing him for a biography, meeting 11 times over 18 months at Moss's apartment. After a year and a half of discussions, Costello finally agreed to tell his complete story, but the biography would never be finished. In early February 1973, Costello suffered a heart attack at his Central Park West apartment. He was rushed to Doctors Hospital in Manhattan. The damage was severe. At 82, his body could not recover. Loretta stayed by his side through 11 days of decline. She held his hand. She watched him stare out the window toward Queens, toward the cemetery where his mausoleum waited. On February 18, 1973, at 7:30 in the evening, Frank Costello died. His wife of 59 years was his only survivor. Charlie the Blade, Tureen, one of the younger mobsters who had sought Costello's advice over the years, called Peter Moss with the news. Tureen said he was gone and then hung up. The funeral was held 3 days later, on February 21st, at the Frank E. Campbell Funeral Chapel on Madison Avenue and 31st Street, the same funeral home that had hosted the services for Rudolph Valentino, Judy Garland, and countless other celebrities. Costello's body lay in a polished walnut casket, dressed in a navy blue suit, white shirt, and dark blue tie. A bank of white orchids, red roses, and white gladioli covered the foot of the casket. 7 floral arrangements surrounded him, modest by mob funeral standards. The wake was held in the chapel's Williamsburg room. About 125 people came to pay respects over 2 days. Most were well-dressed, middle-aged men who arrived by cab or on foot, entering as quietly as they could to avoid the reporters outside. A family friend named Philip Kennedy screened visitors at the door. Strangers were asked to pay their respects briefly and leave. Only about 30 people were allowed to remain in the room at any time, smoking, chatting quietly, renewing old acquaintances. Noticeably absent were almost everyone important. The politicians Costello had bribed for decades stayed away. The judges he had owned did not show. The mayors, the senators, the businessmen who had shaken his hand at Salvation Army fundraisers and Democratic conventions, none of them came. The men who had called him Uncle Frank and sought his favor now pretended they had never known him. Of all Costello's powerful friends, only restaurateur Toots Shore appeared at the gravesite. Shore had run a famous Manhattan restaurant that Costello frequented. He alone had the courage or the loyalty to show up. About 50 people gathered at St. The Burial, took place at Michael's Cemetery in East Elmhurst, Queens. It was a brief ceremony. Law enforcement officers mingled with mourners, watching and noting names. The press gathered outside, taking photographs. Loretta Costello stood beside the Greek temple-style mausoleum her husband had built years earlier. It had been paid for through a frontman named Amilcare Festa to avoid tax scrutiny. The mausoleum was modest by mafia standards, but dignified. White stone, classical columns, the name Costello carved above the door. Loretta placed a flower on the casket as it entered the crypt. The doors closed. Frank Costello was interred. One visitor remarked that he did not make a very good corpse. And then, Loretta vanished. This is where the story becomes strange. Loretta Geigerman Costello, born in 1894, married to Frank for 59 years, present at his death and burial, disappears from the historical record after February 1973. No death certificate has been publicly located for her. No obituary appeared in New York newspapers. No grave marker exists beside Frank's mausoleum at St. Michael's Cemetery. Her siblings, Ruth, Jerome, Harold, and several others, left their own genealogical traces in public records. But Loretta herself becomes a ghost. Some sources suggest she died after 1973. That is it. No date, no cause, no location, no indication of where or how this woman, the widow of America's most famous mob boss, spent her final years. How does someone simply vanish? Possible explanations exist. She may have changed her name after Frank's death, seeking anonymity after decades of unwanted attention. She may have moved away from New York, perhaps to be with distant relatives far from the reporters and FBI agents who had monitored her husband for so long. She may have died quietly in a nursing home, her passing unremarked, because the reporters who once hounded her had moved on to newer stories. Or she may have been protected, deliberately hidden from any record, her final years erased by people who still remembered how to make things disappear. We do not know. What we do know is that Loretta Costello inherited a name that meant nothing without children to carry it forward. She inherited a mausoleum. She inherited a bombed legacy. She inherited decades of memories from a marriage that, by all accounts, was devoted, if complicated by mistresses and crimes and prison sentences and assassination attempts. And then, she vanished. But even Frank Costello's grave couldn't rest in peace. On January 26, 1974, what would have been Costello's 83rd birthday, someone bombed his mausoleum. The explosion blew the doors off the crypt. The noise echoed through St. Michael's Cemetery. The blast made headlines across New York. Even in death, Frank Costello couldn't escape violence. The suspected culprit was Carmine Galante, a violent mob boss who had just been released from prison. Galante had been Costello's enemy for years. The bombing was a message, a final insult. Frank Costello was not forgotten, not forgiven, not safe, even in the grave. Today you can still see the damage. The mausoleum stands in St. Michael's Cemetery, bearing the scars of that explosion. The replacement doors don't quite match the original design. Tourists and mob enthusiasts visit regularly. They take photographs. They stand where Loretta once stood. But no one visits her grave, because no one knows where it is, or if she even has one. The Costello bloodline ended with Frank's death. He left no children to carry his name. His brother Edward faded into nothing decades earlier. His sister in Italy, whose name does not appear consistently in records, remained a footnote in someone else's story. His mistress, Thelma Martin, disappeared completely after he died, leaving behind no letters, no memoirs, no trace. And Loretta became a question mark, the most mysterious footnote to the most documented mob boss in American history. Frank Costello built one of the most powerful criminal empires America has ever seen. He influenced presidents, controlled cities, amassed the equivalent of billions. He was the real-life Godfather, the man Marlon Brando studied to create Vito Corleone, adopting his raspy voice and his calm demeanor. But Vito Corleone had sons. Michael, Sonny, Fredo. Frank Costello had no one. His legitimate businesses passed to anonymous investors. His criminal enterprises passed to Vito Genovese and the men who came after. His political connections severed the moment he stopped being useful. His apartment at the Majestic was eventually sold. It went for over $5 million, decades later. Someone else lives there now, looking out at the same view of Central Park, probably unaware of who came before. Nothing carried his name. Nothing carried his blood. Speaking of mob bosses whose families faced very different fates, Lucky Luciano, Costello's partner of 40 years, did leave people behind when he died in exile. But what happened to them is a story almost no one talks about. If you want to see what became of the Luciano bloodline after the boss of bosses drew his last breath in a Naples airport, watch what happened to Lucky Luciano's family after he died.